set limits both to the amount of words that you can write, and you know, certainly work on limiting the time for the exam. So give me 1 more week to consider this more closely, and then I'll get back to you. So in continuing with our syllabus, well, in fairness sake, I just got to stop here and ask you if you've got any questions. Not that I want to hear any questions after reading thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of words in your tests. But nonetheless, just to be fair, do you have any questions, any comments? Brilliant. I'm not going to wait too long. So we're busy with our classical economics, and just a few words on John Stuart Mill. We've discussed Bentham, and obviously what you would have seen is that there's a lot of material that can be discussed, not just with regard to Bentham, but the entire utilitarian approach. One thing that you've got to be aware of is that it is just very, very crucial for economics, and sometimes in very subtle ways that it introduces ways of doing things that from the 1820s, 1830s that have affected the way we do economics, and we might look at towards the end of the course, get to some of that. I have the impression I'm talking very softly. If that is the case, raise your hand and make a noise. If I don't hear from you, I assume I'm talking loud enough. John Stuart Mill, of course, is, you know, he defined the latter part of classical economics. Let me just write, since we don't have a blackboard, just to make sure that we know who we're talking about. John Stuart Mill, he's first and foremost known as a philosopher, but he certainly defined, he's still important, very important in philosophy, and less so important in economics. And so that's why I say he's really more known as a philosopher, but certainly in his days, he was extremely well known as a political economist. I may have said so earlier, he had written a book. It was like a textbook that was used from the 1940s until the 1870s, the standard English language text in political economy. And well, you know, famous in philosophy for books like On Liberty, on Utilitarianism. The name, I think I mentioned that. His father, James Stuart, was a very good friend of Bentham, and I mentioned implications that had for the education of poor John Stuart Mill. But I also gave you an indication of what John Stuart Mill had to say about Bentham, even though he sympathized with much of the approach of Bentham and with much of Bentham's utilitarianism. He didn't really sympathize, well, he didn't really sympathize with Bentham as a person so much, saying that he was exceptionally badly placed to say anything fruitful on the human condition. So there you've had a person that was a bit of a suffering person, John Stuart Mill, and in that sense, certainly the opposite of Bentham. Many of you would have come across the expression of positivism. and sort of there was a positivism that dominated philosophy, logical positivism in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. It's certainly been taken over by economists as well. It's gone out of favor in philosophy, but it is very much still in favor in economics. Except nowadays they don't talk about it so much as positivism as they talk about it as naturalism. One moment, I've just got to switch off my device here. And well, there was an earlier version of positivism, which at the term, the expression was introduced by a man, a Frenchman. I write his name here. Auguste Comte, and he introduced the expression of positivism. He is considered one of the type of founders of sociology, and for him, positivism was a stage in the intellectual development of humankind, and where he would have seen that before positivism there were two other periods, and the one would have been the period of dating back to the Greeks, classical Greeks. Before that, everything was seen in terms of our thinking was explained in terms of being influenced by our belief in God and our search for God. And then a later period would have been the period of metaphysical thinking. And of course, into that period, he would have put in most of Aristotle and developments up to his time. And then positivism, in his expression, was that third and final stage where we are now in our scientific thinking. We are anti-metaphysical. We step beyond the metaphysical, and so according to him, we found ourselves in the era of positivism. So I'm talking about the period of around about 1860, 1870. John Stuart Mill was a good friend of Auguste Comte, and Auguste Comte, he went a bit mad, and John Stuart Mill took him in to his house, brought him from France, from Paris to England, and sort of, had him stay with him for a while. But you get the sort of people that eventually turn against their friends as well, and Auguste Comte did that. But the point here is that John Stuart Mill was the man who introduced the thinking of Comte to England, or parts of that thinking, and therefore also introduced the idea of positivism into English thought. And around about that time, you would have the father of John Maynard Keynes. His name was John Neville Keynes. He was also a political economist, and also a student of Mill. He then introduced more forcefully the idea of positive statements in economics as opposed to normative statements. But what you will see is that is a variation on the idea of positivism and positive statements and normative statements. And that was a lot more fully developed and more rigorously developed in a more empirical manner, supposedly, by the logical positivists of the 1830s onwards. Anyway, so we see John Stuart Mill, they're at the beginning of that positivist revolution in intellectual thinking. And well, he certainly was in the classification that we've been using in this course up to now, talking about the realism and nominalism, remembering, you know, there's many meanings of those terms, so always got to be careful explaining how we use those terms, but the nominalism and realism that we're talking about is a nominalism and realism with regards to universals, general terms. And the statement that John Stuart Mill made was that all definitions are definitions of words only. I'll write that down. Okay, actually, he said all definitions are definitions of words always. It's like if you're giving a definition, you are basically just explaining how you are using words. You're not defining something that exists out there. You are defining a use of language. It's a continuation of the idea of Hobbes that we've come across, and basically. He's saying to the degree that words are arbitrary, like you could have different words as long as we agree on a definition of the word, the word can be anything. And that, of course, is the nominalist tradition. Although, as we would see in a further course on these topics, is that often, you know, a lot of lip service is given to that. For instance, in his case, he was 100 years later, he was criticized by Becker and Stigler. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these names. Gary Becker and George Stigler. They wrote a very important article. And that was 1977. And that article is called De Gustibus non est disputantum, which is Latin for saying that we can't argue about tastes. Well, what they're saying really by that is tastes are not something for economists to argue about, in the sense that we should go out and go into the psyche of individuals and find out what the tastes are. Rather, tastes are, according to their view, tastes are just part of the human capital. And what they criticized, and I'm saying tastes are what they are, like the Rocky Mountains, they are what they are, who cares? But what they're saying is we must not, so that's very important, explain the differences in behavior between people by relying on the notion of tastes, because we're inclined to say that person A does such and such and buys this because those are her tastes, and person B did differently because she's got different tastes. They're saying you can't use that explanation, because then you're really giving up as an economist. You're saying, well, it's not for me I can't explain it because I cannot explain tastes. What they want to do is they want to actually explain tastes, those choices that might otherwise be referred to as taste, to be simply the outcome of accumulation or destruction, if you like, of human capital. And instead, if the economist has succeeded only as an economist if he can explain economic behavior in terms of price, relative income, and human capital. And so everything should be reducible to those three variables, any differences in human behavior. And they criticized, I mean, this is a bit of a detour, but they criticized John Stuart Mill, because that's exactly what John Stuart Mill did in his book of the 1840s and later as well, where he explained certain decisions of individuals and groups in terms of fashion fads and cultural backgrounds, and really relying on phenomena that are rather fuzzy in a sense. Certainly from an economist's point of view, they're fuzzy, they're not quantifiable. If you're talking about fashion fads, culture, tastes, as did John Stuart Mill, then these expressions are difficult to nail down, and they're certainly not quantifiable. And even though he was sort of at the beginning of the age of positivism, it's only at the time of Becker and Stigler when they try and reduce all of these things like fashion fads and values. We talked about values in the past and norms, reducing all of those to human capital, prices, and taste. So what I'm saying with this, even though John Stuart Mill by lip service is a positivist and he's got a nominalist attitude with regard to language, nonetheless, when he is talking and explaining things using terms such as fashion fads, tastes, and culture, then he seems to ascribe some importance to those things, as if these are things that exist outside our definition of words, if you like. And so you will see that, of course, much later as well in the work of Friedman, even Becker and Stigler, is that eventually, often, even though we proclaim to be nominalists, we are still using language in a common sense, even realist type of way. But for us, what remains for us to talk about in terms of John Stuart Mill is that he drew the important distinction, saying that, yes, let us look at production, and he accepted all of classical economics. And he said that certainly when we're looking at production, we are subject to nature to an extent, to a large extent, because whatever you're doing, you have to employ the forces of nature. In microeconomics, you will talk about things like marginal rate of technical substitution. These are, in a sense, technological aspects, and technological aspects are related to nature, to engineering, to science. The time, that you've got so many hours a day, that's a limit. And so when it comes to production, he says we've got nature playing an important role. And of course, there he's building on, and he's taking over the analysis of the physiocrats, Adam Smith, and also David Ricardo, as you would have seen in David Ricardo's theory of rent. But he said, and he said that when it comes to the distribution of income, that is not at all the case. The distribution of income, it's up to us. We're not subject to nature. It's a matter of convention. So conventions, in his view, are now becoming important. Certainly, convention fits in, with an analysis that goes along with fashion fads, culture, and tastes. It's not a natural thing, but we can make a choice. Okay, I mean, it's also funny enough, but you know, there are those analogies and those links when he says that all definitions are definitions of words always. That's also an indication that, well, that words are just a matter of convention and not much more than that. Yes, Christopher.
I just wanted to ask on that note, I think in one of the readings it suggested that Mill was... Can you hear me?
Okay, there's a hand up, but I don't hear. I suppose you can all hear me speaking, otherwise you would have. If anybody's got anything to say, please just talk.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, that seems to be a mistake. And it's important
Prof,
because
we can hear Chris.
That,
can you hear him?
The distribution, and if you think about it, he may have a point, because if you look at our modern society, you look at our modern economies, you will see, for instance, that, well, firstly, let me ask that question. What is, and I may have asked that in a previous session, what is the modern economics, our neoclassical economics, if we were to give a name to our theory of distribution, what is the name that we're giving it? Okay, I'm getting a message here that, yes, thank you for making me aware of that. I can't hear you because my speaker is muted. Forgive me. Okay. So, Christopher, you had a comment or a remark or a question?
Can you hear me now?
First class, I can hear you.
That's good. I just wanted to ask, in one of the readings, I think it was in one of the readings, it suggested that John Stuart Mill was pretty much akin to a socialist. So would that be an accurate observation?
Well, he was heavily influenced by his mistress, and she was a woman that fought heavily for the universal suffrage or suffrage for women in England. And he certainly, you know, his environment was anything but socialist. You know, we're talking about, well, Bentham with having relatively radical ideas, but not necessarily socialist or not at all socialist. And then also his father and the environment. And it was through his mistress, Harriet Taylor, I think was her name. She was a widow and had a daughter, and she was socialist. And so he started developing socialist leanings. And of course, you know, to a degree, that can be amenable to, or utilitarianism can be amenable to that. You know, today we would talk about welfare. You know, economic welfare, it can be maximized, not necessarily. Or if that's what we want to achieve, at the end, the goal has to be a maximum welfare. We can now develop different ways of trying to achieve that, and they don't necessarily have to be based on even a market economy, on capitalism or private property. He wasn't radical as a socialist. He was very cautious. And it certainly would have alienated him greatly if he had been any more radical. But he had socialist leanings. I think they were more inherited than natural to him, but they would show themselves to play a role in exactly his theory of distribution. Because, well, let me get back to the question on the distribution. What would be our neoclassical theory of distribution? When I asked that last time, somebody had an answer. And while you think about that, I'm just going to get some water. When I said inherited, a socialist idea, I don't mean inherited it from his father, but more inherited or adopted under the influence of his mistress. What is our theory of distribution in economics? Somebody said it last time. Does that mean that not everybody is present, even though even though your initial show? To remind you, we've got the marginal productivity theory of distribution, that the income that you earn is a function of your productivity. In particular, is a function of your productivity of the last unit that you work, for instance. And so what it implies is that everybody gets what they deserve. Everybody gets the product, the marginal portion of that product that they have contributed. And in that sense, income distribution is directly linked to production. Let's say because you earn your income as the owner of a factor of production, be that factor of production labor or capital or land, managerial enterprise. The factors are rewarded according to their marginal productivity. And so our income that we earn as factor owners are equal to or correlated to the productivity of those factors of production. So in a sense, we're going backwards from John Stuart Mill, because we're linking production and distribution to be one again. If you were to consider production and distribution in the case of David Ricardo, from what you remember about the theory of rent, would he have considered that production and distribution are tightly linked, the way that they are in modern neoclassical economics, the way they are, in other words, in terms of the marginal productivity theory of distribution? What would have been Ricardo's point on that? What about rent? The landlords are earning rent. How do they earn it?
Good evening.
Yes, Mpumelelo.
I don't think Ricardo would have necessarily 100% agreed with the marginal productivity of distribution, because the landlords would absorb the income of, so to speak, when society grows. So they are not, their marginal productivity has not changed, but the amount of distribution of their income has increased.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's the best example there, the best point there about the landlords. They've got the land, whatever the land they have, they don't do anything about the land. You could say just about it's a matter of economic development or even poor luck, how much that they are earning. And we use the expression and that's the expression that Marx would have used, and Keynes used it as well. Basically saying,
can you still see the rent as being a marginal productivity of the land? Not of the landlord, but of the land.
Okay, yes. I mean, we've got the marginal productivity of the land, and that's, of course, his contribution to and the beginnings of our marginalist analysis. And what he wants to establish now, he wants to say that the land is productive however it is productive. You know, that's the land. But it's arbitrary that the surplus that is earned by the land should go to the landlords. It could really go to anybody. It can be appropriated by government, for instance, and distributed. It could be owned by government. It doesn't have to be owned by the landlords. And so, and that's where we see that some of the sort of socialist ideas can come in, because if it is really a matter of convention, you know, where should that surplus that is being earned, where is that rent, which is unearned earnings, because no effort is put into it. It is the fruit, if you like, of nature, as the physiocrats would have said. It becomes a matter of convention where it is going to. And that is what he wanted to argue, that when it comes to distribution, it's really up to society to decide how distribution is to occur. Chesri, yes.
So one could go one step further with the labor theory of value, that the land is not just arbitrarily valuable, it's valuable because it's being claimed by laborers, because it's been not the immediate labor in the current time period which works for the land. The fact that the land itself exists as a usable, arable resource is itself due to past labor.
We're not in a disagreement here. If you know, when we look at the productivity of the land, the marginal product, we have seen that for the capitalists, I mean, basically there is a surplus. There's like a surplus. The expression to be used is not a surplus. We're not necessarily using the expression surplus. There's another one. It will come to my mind in a moment. But it's the amount above the labor that's put into the cultivation of the lands. That goes to either the capitalist or the landlords. And we see that as there's economic development, the capitalist may work equally hard and invest his capital, but he's getting less and less out of that surplus. He's getting less and less as economic development or growth or more land is being put under production. So it's the same amount of land producing the same amount of output, but the distribution of it, depending on where we are in terms of the total amount of land used, more, or as may be the case, less will go to the capitalist and more or less may go to the landlords. And so the distribution there is not really determined by whether the landlord or the capitalist is working harder or not. It is reduced. It is determined by factors other than that. It's really determined by the amount of land and the cultivation. And so it's not the marginal productivity of either the landlords or the capitalist that determines how much that they're getting. That's why it's got a particular expression which will come to mind in a moment. And so we don't deny the marginal productivity of lands, but we're looking at, if there's a surplus, how does that get allocated? And so John Stuart Mill takes that idea further and says, well, the same applies really to most of the income that people are earning. Most of the income of people that people are earning is, in a sense, in the form of rent. And it's unearned income from that perspective. And so if you look at, let us take the chairperson of South African Airways. Okay, I mean, she was barred. She was barred by a court of law as a director in a company, any company in South Africa, because what she did was just so disastrous. I mean, you know, we're living with parts of the consequences of how badly she managed it rather than the CEO. She managed SAA, and you know, it's a disaster, and the country and I don't know what's the situation with SAA at the moment, but certainly they are under what's it called, under management. Well, what she earned was not an expression of her productivity, was it? It was an expression of how good she was, how much she contributed, because many would argue she should repay SAA rather than having earned a salary. And so, you know, that is a modern example where you can say, well, people don't seem to be earning what they contribute towards the output of a firm. But if she earned what she earned, and let's assume she earned millions, I mean, a previous CEO of South African Airways, I think his name was Anderson. He was a CEO in the 1990s and early 2000s. He earned like 200 million rand as a CEO. But certainly the amount that the chairperson of SAA earned would have been due to the fact that she held that particular position. Like the landlords hold a particular land, she was holding a particular position. And you might call that an incumbency theory of distribution, that people earn the income that they're earning, not because of their productivity or contribution to output, but they earn that money because of the position that they occupy. That position may be the position of a president. You know, you look at the president, or certainly the past president, earning, just if you talk about actual earnings, it's millions. I'm not talking about the additional fringe benefits, which come to billions, but it's not earning according to marginal productivity theory. Okay, it's earning according to being in a position. And so it's really arbitrary, you know, in the sense that the salary that is being paid to a president, or the salary that is being paid to the CEO of a company, it's arbitrary. It's very often, it's not even sucked from your thumb anymore. I mean, what happens when it comes to salaries of CEOs in the past, from the 1990s to now? In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a feeling that CEOs, especially in America, are earning way too much. They were earning $1 and $2 million per annum. They were earning 20 times more than the average employee. And because of that, they introduced a law where any company on the stock exchange, any listed company, would have to declare what the CEO is earning. And the idea was that if they indicate on the financial statements what the CEO is earning, it's like an exercise of name and shame. Wow, look at this CEO, look how greedy he is. He's earning $2 million. And the hope was that that would keep in check the salaries of CEOs. But of course, the opposite happened. The complete opposite happened, because that was used by recruitment consultants and people that are specialists in finding jobs for CEOs. Or any advisor, they would go to a CEO and say, we have just discovered that according to the financial statements in company A, this person is earning $3 million but your position is the same. You're only earning $1 million, so you got to insist, and we will consult, and we will put the argument for you so that you should also earn $3 or $4 million. And as a result, salaries just moved up and up and up. And now, even in South Africa, the CEO of Pick n Pay probably earns in the region of 60 million rand. And so an incumbency theory of income distribution would really be saying, and John Stuart Mill would be saying that, this is not, that's got little to do with marginal productivity, but it's got to do with the rent which a particular position can generate, and how much of that rent goes to the CEO, for instance, as a salary, or how much of it goes to the shareholders, for instance. And so the distribution, that the groups that we may look at in terms of who gets the money, the benefits of this rent, it may not be expressed in terms of landlords and capitalists, but it can certainly be expressed in terms of top employees, CEOs, as opposed to shareholders. But of course, there are economic theories that would want to argue against that, neoclassical economic theories that would want to argue against that. But I'm talking about it at this point, especially in order to illustrate to you what John Stuart Mill meant by saying that when it comes to income distribution, we are no longer under the power of nature as we are in the case of production, but it is a matter of convention. And it can be, if you like, it can be engineered. It would be, today we might use the expression of, it could be part of the social engineering that will be employed. And so this is usually one of the aspects of the work of John Stuart Mill that is held up as being important, where he had a break from his predecessors, and also where, and I think in the video that you would have seen on the natural origins of economics, where this is being discussed by Shabazz, where she says that as Mill wants to downplay the importance of nature for distribution, giving recognition to convention as regards distribution. She says that was like an early movement away from the natural origins of economics. I would say that, and maybe that's one of the things that you may have picked up, and some of you have picked up in your essays. It's a point that Chesri raised last week. It's a bit confusing, this whole discussion about nature. And the reason really is that nature is understood in many different ways, which we would have seen in the video on the natural law in economics with regard to Aquinas and Aristotle, that certainly when Aristotle uses the term nature, he means by it something different from what Thomas Hobbes or John Locke understands when they use the term nature. Neither of them is either right or wrong. They are just different meanings. They are different, words have different meanings, and we've got to make sure that we understand that we're using the words with the same meaning. I mean, you take the word of, how many meanings of the word cause are there? You should know that. How many different meanings of the, if you were to guess?
Well, at minimum 4.
At minimum 4. And Aristotle spent a lot of time in his book on metaphysics, showing that your minimum 4, but that's also the maximum, and that it's really exactly 4, at least up to his time. There were only, there are 4 different meanings of the word nature. If you look at a word like in, there's probably a dozen different meanings of the word in. I'm sitting in this room and we are in class and I'm in a bad mood today and there's water, there's, you know, a tooth in my mouth. And if the tooth gets knocked out, it's still in my mouth, but it's in my mouth in a different sense. And so you have a word like in that's got a myriad of different meanings. And so much of the confusion that arises with regard to sort of this natural law in economics and nature in economics, it has to do with the different meanings of the word nature. And I think Shabazz, in a sense, doesn't give enough justice to that, because certainly the work of John Stuart Mill is a lot closer to that of Hobbes and Locke than it is to the work of Aristotle and Aquinas. So if there's an important change, a change when it comes to the natural origins of economics, a more important break is the time of the break that was made by Hobbes and Locke, in my view, rather than by John Stuart Mill. But anyway, that is the subject of a thesis. If anybody's interested, okay, no takers. All right, let's leave John Stuart Mill here at this point, unless you've got any questions on your side. And we're just going to do, we're going to talk again about some of the critics of classical economics. When we look at Austrian economics, probably next week or the week after, I suppose, we're just going to talk about the German historical school again, because they certainly were amongst the critics of classical economy. But certainly the most important critic that we're going to be looking at is none other than Karl Marx. Okay, many of you would have had, or for some it may be totally new to do Karl Marx, and others may have had Karl Marx many lectures and many courses even on Karl Marx. What we'll be looking at the economics of Karl Marx, and often students, especially from the social sciences, tell me, well, you know, that is a totally different Karl Marx that we economists talk about compared to the Karl Marx that they are familiar with. At least coming from sociology and philosophy and political science. And so our focus, of course, will be on Karl Marx, the economist. He spent just that little bit on his story. He did spend, when he was in London, he spent all his time going to the British Library and studying the classical economists. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Senior, Nassau, also studying the physiocrats, studying, going as far back, certainly also studying William Petty. And so he knew his classical political economy. He knew it extremely well. And not by accident that he's got a book titled The Critique of, what is it called? The Critique of Political Economy. That's in addition to Das Kapital. And of course, he is famous for his Communist Manifesto. And we've had a video on the Communist Manifesto, right? With all the marking I was doing, I didn't get to look at this, I think. Sorry, I did look at it, and the Communist Manifesto was mentioned in particular. And so, of course, we associated Marx with communism, but you've got to be aware of the fact that he didn't write much about communism, what communism would look like. He wrote mostly about a critique of political economy, of classical economics, and to a degree coming from an actual classical economic perspective, critiquing it. And of course, it's a matter of how we interpret certain authors, and he would certainly have interpreted David Ricardo as having had a labor theory of value. That is the time before the marginalist revolution, where value is now determined or defined in terms of the marginal utility associated with a product. Of course, he was aware of utilitarianism and of course rejected it. We may talk a bit about him in a moment, about his philosophy, his relationship to Hegel and things like this. But for the sake of time, let's get to the most important parts from the economics perspective, and that is really how we getting to well, how he used the labor theory of value. Because that clearly is most immediate, most obviously a matter of an economic matter, and how the labor of theory has an impact on the laws of motion of capitalism. And very often Marx sort of mistakenly gets similarities are drawn between Marx and Aristotle, for instance, because what he says, underlying, if you dig a bit deeper, if you dig below the surface, you're going to get to the real laws of motion, and the real laws of motion aren't supply and demand, they are the functioning of the entire structure. But now the laws of motion of capitalism, what are the laws of motion of capitalism? The laws of motions of capitalism is such that capitalism already has planted within itself the seeds for its own destruction. And at the time, you would have seen how this capitalistic system was actually gaining a huge momentum, is generating large and increased amounts of output, and taking on from what Adam Smith was saying, and generating a new society, if you like, and of course he talks about that new society, and that will be in terms of the base and the superstructure, but he was also interested in what it does. What does it mean, this capitalist system that is producing so much output and so many more products? And he says that, well, there are laws of motion in place that will lead to its own destruction. And after that destruction will come the era of socialism and communism. So what we're going to look at is, how does he arrive at those laws of motion of capitalism? And much of it has to do with what he learned from David Ricardo. In particular, if you recall that from Ricardo, the falling rate of profits. Now, the labor theory of value, let's put it like this. I'll give you an example. Let us say that is the time period that's the time that any labor, okay, we are certainly adopting here the Ricardian vice. We're making simplistic assumptions, but so did Karl Marx as well, not only classical economists, that somebody is employed for 12 hours a day to produce a certain good. But after 8 hours, this person has already produced enough to pay its salary. And that anything that's beyond that, anything that's beyond that is really a surplus. So we've got the expressions V and S, and V and S is, V stands for variable capital, and S stands for the surplus. Okay, why variable capital? Why does he, if a laborer takes 8 hours to produce what he produces, he's calling that variable capital? Well, what he's saying is that, well, labor firstly is employed like capital, if you like, except the owners of that capital. Who's the owner of that capital? Not the capitalist. The owner of that capital is the laborer himself or herself. And he says variable because, as opposed to constant capital, okay, which is constant capital is C. He says variable capital, this labor is variable capital because it is labor that creates value. Every value that's ever created is really at the, right now, as it's being employed labor, that is the labor is the cause of value. Or even if you employ capital equipment, there is a labor component there. And so the labor theory of value says that only labor creates value, not capital or any other factor of production. And that's why labor is called the variable, it's called variable capital, because depending on how long you're using it, how long you're employing it, you're creating varying amounts of output. In particular, you're creating varying amounts of surplus. So we got this surplus here, S, and surplus, we've got an expression that's called the rate of surplus, which is S over V. All right, so that's the ratio of, the rate of surplus is the ratio of the surplus over the variable capital. In other words, if the same output can be produced by less labor time, then the surplus will increase and the variable capital will decrease. And so overall, the expression S over V, okay, if we say surplus increases, if the surplus increases and the variable capital decreases, then the rate of surplus as defined by S over V will be increasing. And now that is being used now by his laws of motion of capital and his theory of crisis. And we got to bring into that theory of crisis because, that's what we've got to look at when we do Marx. He says that the capitalist system will run its course, it will fizzle out, it will destroy itself. It will, nowadays we're talking about a recession. And then if things get a bit worse, we talk about a depression. What was a very famous depression? Economic depression.
The Great
You've heard
Depression?
about the Great Depression, thank you, of 1926. Marx would have said that's not a depression, that's a crisis, that's a crisis. And he would say that, you know, we can lurch, and what we will see as we go through his analysis here, we'll see that you can move into depression, but the depression will have its own seeds of recovery, if you like. We get out of the depression, but then we get into a new depression, a deeper depression, and we come out of it, and then we go into an even further depression until you can't use the word depression anymore. You just got to call it the crisis. And so that's a theory of crisis. And eventually it will be such that given those crises, the system will, and we'll talk about how it will come to that end. Now, in order to explain how we move in this laws of motion of capitalism, we got to draw a clear distinction between the rate of surplus and the rate of profit. The rate of profit is the surplus divided by the sum of constant and variable capital. Okay, so the rate of profit is somewhat different from the rate of surplus. And that's very important, okay, in terms of the role of constant capital played in this analysis. Okay, and we know, well, we know from David Ricardo that we expect the rate of profits to decline. But now, of course, Marx no longer relies entirely and only on the work of David Ricardo, but he's developing his own way of showing that there will be a tendency for the rate of profits to decline. Okay, so the rate of profit doesn't always necessarily decline, but it declines on average. And so we've got to, what we've got to bring into this is something called the organic composition of capital. Okay, the organic composition of capital. It really means, you know, what type of capital is there in an economy, in an industry, in a firm? What type of capital? Well, we've got two types of capital that we've talked about so far. We've got variable capital and constant capital. So the organic composition of capital has to do with the with constant, the ratio of constant and variable capital. If you go to your readings and you look at the chapter by Rima, she gives a full definition of the organic composition of capital, and it's got a constant factor there. But for simplicity's sake, for our exposition, we will take the organic composition of capital to be simply C over V. Okay, that's a very important expression, the organic composition of capital. It's because once we put together the organic composition of capital and the rate of the falling rate of profit, then we will basically set in motion, if you like, that pan. We'll set in motion the laws of motion, the laws of motion. Whew, that's terrible. We'll set in motion the laws of motion of capitalism. And so if I go back to our rate of profit, okay, what we're going to do we're going to employ a simple mathematical expedient. Okay, that's especially for those students who don't like maths. we're just going to do that exercise. We're dividing the whole expression by V. What does dividing by V mean? Well, whenever you see an expression above the line or below the line, you divide that expression by V, right? So that will mean, let me write that for you again. So what if we divide that entire expression by V using that expedient, then we've got S over V, and we've got C over V, and V over V. Okay, so that is still just a different way of expressing the rate of the rate of profit. Except we made it more, instead of make it simpler, we've made it more difficult by bringing in this V expression. But you will see in a moment that making it more difficult has got certain benefits. Well, one, V over V is just 1. Okay, so we can get off the expression V over V. And then the rate of profit now is S over V divided by C over V plus 1. But what is C? We've already defined C over V. What is that expression?
The organic composition of capital.
That's the organic composition of capital. All right. So that organic composition of capital, the whole thing is still a way of representing the rate of profit. Except now, when we talk about the rate of profit, we also got inside that rate of profit our organic composition of capital. And we're going to be seeing how the organic composition of capital will affect the rate of profit. Because the organic composition of capital, what is it? It is really the ratio of human life, labor, capital, as opposed to or related to the quantity of constant capital. That is, what is constant capital? Didn't elaborate on that sufficiently. What is the constant capital?
It is, for instance, the labor, not the labor, the land, the physical capital that you use, and things that are outside the necessary labor that is for production.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I mean, it is, as he says, it is, and we call it constant because you know, if you take equipment, if you take machinery, it is what it is. It doesn't create value. It is constant. It is fixed. That's why he's calling it constant capital as opposed to variable capital. Mpumelelo.
Yes, I just wanted to add, he calls it the dead capital.
Death capital. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, probably multiple meanings to the word death capital, but certainly it is debt. It doesn't add value. It is what it is. And so what we are saying in our analysis is that the rate of surplus will be affected by two things. We will know that the rate of profit is affected obviously by the surplus that is generated by labor. And that is in the original definition of the falling rate of profit, of the rate of profit. But now he's also saying not only is the rate of profit determined or affected by surplus, the rate of surplus, but it's also affected by the composition of capital. That is important because what have we experienced in capitalism in terms of the ratio of constant and variable what defines capitalism? Take the very expression capital, das Kapital. Okay, das Kapital. Clearly, capital must play the crucial role in Marx's analysis of his theory of crisis. Capital must play a crucial role in his theory of capitalism if he calls the book Das Kapital. And it's not by accident that we've got the organic composition of capital, in our rate of surplus. And we know, back to my question to you, what do we know about capitalism? It's experiencing growth and growth and growth of capital, isn't it? Capital is growing. The amount of equipment, machinery that's being employed in production, it's not diminishing, it is increasing. I mean, when cars were first produced 120 years ago, most of it was labor, manual labor, and then the assembly line got introduced, and now motor vehicles are being, there's a few people that operate machinery, but it's much of the work, the welding and what have you, gets done by robots. So capital is growing and growing and growing. And what he wants to analyze, he says that the capitalist system will lead to a growth in constant capital, but it's going to have consequences for the rate of profit. Can you hear that noise? Somebody's car alarm went off. Okay. Okay, so we've set the scene. I'm going to stop at this point because that is terrible. I've set the scene. Next week when we meet again, we're going to go back to our rate of profit, and we're going to look at how changes in the organic composition of capital will have an impact on this capitalistic system. All right, any questions on your side? That's great, and then I'll see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Prof.
Okay, bye.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.